Behind me is San Juan Hill, which is the site of the major land battle of the Spanish-American War, and by far the best known of the very few battles that occurred during the war. It was here that that the Spanish defenders looked down upon the Americans during the attack on San Juan Hill and Kettle Hill on July 1st, 1898. This is the one in which Theodore Roosevelt and the famous Rough Riders participated. So let me walk you through the basics of the Spanish-American War and the Philippine War. And this is going to be, in essence, a guide to what's in for the common defense. I'm not going to go much beyond that. However, I'm going to take off these glasses and go with these glasses, which are a little less geek-like. Okay, I'm going to share the screen with you. Share this, back it up to where it needs to be. Okay, these are the terms. And these are the learning objectives. By the end of this presentation, you should know this is weird. Okay. By the end of this presentation, you should know the concept of informal empire there, how and why the United States became an informal empire, the origins, course, and consequences of the Spanish-American War, the decision to annex the Philippine Islands, and then the origins, course, and consequences of the Philippine War. And you'll find details of all of this in For the Common Defense. So let's get started on it. To begin with, we're dealing at the turn of the century with a changing America. I talked a bit about this in terms of the military and naval reforms. This is an America that's going from rural to urban, that is experiencing a sharp increase in population, the process of urbanization, industrialization, and moving toward an organizational society. So rather than having sort of island communities where they were sort of essentially self-governing and that people were part of this, of a kind of a local world, you're dealing now with a society that is much more interconnected and requires a higher degree of organization. And this leads to an impulse called progressivism, where people who were both Republicans and Democrats became interested in creating more of an administrative state. They began to think in terms of that the United States needed to be governed in the same way as large corporations did. So you still had elected officials and so forth, but you also had a much larger number of administrators who were unelected, but who performed, key tasks within the framework of broader legislation. A crisis of masculinity, that's the third point. This is kind of interesting. At this particular time, you're dealing with a change in what it meant to be a man. Now, before this time, you would start off as a laborer, and then you would aspire to becoming, independent merchant or farmer or something like that, but economically independent. With the rise of large corporations, this was no longer really viable. If you were going to move up the ladder, you moved into often a salaried or administrative position, but you weren't your own man, so to speak, in an economic sense. So you have to, redefine what it means to be manly. And this new definition of manliness is more along the lines of masculinity. Some people talk in terms of a distinction between manliness and masculinity. Masculinity is sort of the emergence of the modern, concept. In the 19th century, you could be kind of portly, rather like me and so forth. But if you were a successful, economically independent businessman, that was what it meant to be a man. At this time, there's a sense more, well, I can't be economically independent, but I can be physically strong and virile, and so on. And this is kind of what, when you look at attractive men today, that's what you're going for. And along with this, was a sense that as the United States became more urbanized, when you're doing a rural job, a farmer, this kind of thing, it's very physical. But when you're a laborer in an urban area, or you're sitting on your butt all day long, as a clerk or something along those kinds of lines, there's a sense that that men are becoming soft. So how do you remedy this? Well, this is the period of time where you begin to see, at the high school level and at the college level, the rise of competitive sports in an organized sense, and that these become important. Another aspect of masculinity, for those who could afford it, would be more hunting. Um, if you're rich, go to Africa and participate in safaris, and this kind of a thing. So when you're dealing with the Spanish-American War, it would be too much to say that this crisis of masculinity caused the Spanish-American War, but it set the conditions. It created a cultural environment in which Americans saw the war as an opportunity to demonstrate, their virility and masculinity, and the idea of American society as being strong. And so it's an interesting dimension that actually feminist historians sort of came up with, but it makes a lot of sense. So there's Uncle Sam, heading off to war and looking appropriately, masculine, kind of badass. Okay. In terms of the war itself, I'm going to leave you, to get this from for the common defense, a lot of it, but the background is that that Cuba is still in the hands of the Spanish. It's still a colony, and the Cubans had been rebelling for some years, and the Spanish attempts to put down this rebellion sparked a sense of sort of outrage on the part of Americans. And so when you look at contemporary books that came out on the Spanish-American War, the war is often framed in humanitarian terms. The United States had to intervene to get rid of this sort of despotic, Spanish. So it's really more complicated than that, but that's the way that it was framed at the time. But it was very much a war of choice. There are some wars where you're sort of backed into a corner and it's a last resort and this kind of a thing. But this is a war of choice, in the same way that the American invasion of Iraq in 2003 was a war of choice. We didn't have to do that, but we decided to do it. A major moment in all this, sort of the most famous one, is the battleship USS Maine, one of the modern battleships that we talked about in the Naval Reform section, sailed into Havana Harbor to protect American interests there, and the American population, businessmen and so forth, who were there, and also to kind of serve notice to the Spanish that we're not really happy with you. Well, the Maine blew up, and the immediate explanation for this is the Spanish had to do it. It's a question of, did they do it with a bomb, or did they do it with a torpedo? There was a lot of loss of life and so on. What we now think is that the boiler blew up. The Spanish didn't do anything. It was an engineering problem aboard aboard the Maine. But that didn't really matter, because this really jacked up anti-Spanish sentiment. And the explosion occurs in February 1898. In April, the United States declares war on Spain. There is you have a comparatively small regular army, and so all of a sudden the United States has to ramp up the size of its army quite a bit, and it resorts to volunteer forces. These are mobilized very rapidly. There's limited places where you can train them, and so actually Civil War battlefields like the one in Chickamauga gets used, repurposed as a training ground. Way more troops are actually enlisted than were ever used during the war, and yet these soldiers got pensions just like everybody else, and these were being paid off well into the 20th century. In terms of the higher direction, I will leave that to get, for you to get it for the common defense. But the bottom line is that the military direction of the war at the top in terms of, what are we going to do? What's our plan? How are we going to execute it, and so forth. At the Army level is improvised and kind of messy. At the Navy level is better organized. There's a naval board that does a pretty good job of sorting out what the United States Navy has to do and how it is going to do it. In terms of the major operations of the war, these occur in two different theaters. There is the Caribbean theater, and this is one we sort of think about the most. And the main thing here is twofold. First of all, the Americans get ready to invade Cuba somewhere, and there was thought of invading in the area of Havana, which frankly would have been a disaster because the Spanish actually had a lot of troops on Cuba, on the island of Cuba. But instead, what happened was the Spanish fleet, under a guy named Cervera, sailed into the harbor of Santiago de Cuba. Now, the Americans had been, kind of scared of the Spanish fleet, and there was sort of a sense of, well, they could show up anywhere. They could show up off of New York and bombard that city, and so on. So when the Spanish fleet turns up in Santiago, the focus of the United States Navy and the focus of the Army is to deal with that fleet and to neutralize it. And so the U.S. Navy sails to blockade Santiago de Cuba so that the Spanish fleet, can't get out. And an American expeditionary force sails from Tampa in Florida to an area southeast of Santiago, lands at a place called Dockery, and then begins to move inland with the idea of capturing, the port in which the Spanish fleet is located, and defeating the Spanish fleet in that kind of way, and then by extension, perhaps winning the entire war. Before that happens, though, May 1st, 1898, an American squadron under a guy named Dewey, Commodore Dewey, or Admiral Dewey, sails from Hong Kong to Manila Harbor. And Hong Kong's owned by the British, and the British sort of have kind of get to know some of these naval officers and this kind of thing before they sail off. And what they're thinking is, oh my God, these guys are going to their deaths. But in point of fact, May 1st, that squadron sails into Manila Bay, and within a matter of a couple of hours, destroys the Spanish squadron located there, just wipes it out with, I want to say, not the loss of even a single man, although, there might have been one guy gets killed. The book will tell you for sure, but I'm telling you, in one single blow, the United States wipes out the Spanish squadron in Manila Bay. That gives them control of Manila, which is a major city, really the major city in the Philippines, and sets the conditions for, well, we got the Philippines, what are we going to do with it? That becomes an important post-war question. Here are the area of operations against Santiago de Cuba. And what you can see is that the Americans land in late April, or rather the Navy arrives in late April, and then the American ground forces arrive in June at Dockery. You can see it in the eastern part of the island. They weren't opposed. The Spanish didn't come out to fight them. The first major encounter between the Americans and the Spanish occurs at a place called Las Cosimas, and that's on June 24th. It's a skirmish. The Americans push through. The Spanish defenders, they discover some things about it. Their small arms, use American ones. There's a lot of gunpowder, a lot of smoke and so forth from the gunpowder. The Spanish are actually using superior firearms, smokeless powder, more difficult to see where the Spanish are, but the Americans push forward. And then in early July, launch this attack, July 1st, launch this attack, this famous attack against San Juan Hill and other lesser known positions just east of Santiago de Cuba, and and capture the hill behind me. This forces Cervera's Spanish fleet to try to get the hell out of Dodge in terms of exiting Santiago, and they go out and they confront the American fleet, and then they sail to the west along the shoreline, trying to escape the Americans, and the Americans just clobber them. With their new fleet, their fleet of new battleships and so forth. And it is a major American victory that sort of serves notice that the United States has arrived as a great power. In fact, the idea that the United States, in a matter of months, defeats a major European country, really ushers the United States onto the world stage. No account of the Spanish-American War would be complete without Theodore Roosevelt. Now, Theodore Roosevelt began the war as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and his main contribution as Assistant Secretary of the Navy was to give Dewey his orders to sail into Manila Bay. But then Roosevelt left office as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, became the second in command of the first United States Volunteer Cavalry, known as the Rough Riders, and this, by far, was just the most famous unit in the Spanish-American War. And in terms of this idea of masculinity, Roosevelt epitomized what he called the strenuous life. I mean, he was all about this sort of new concept of masculinity. Went off to Africa later on, did safaris, did treks, expeditions into the American West, and so on. And the year following, wrote a book called The Rough Riders, which is a very interesting read because it really does depict American soldiers. The Rough Riders consisted a lot of Westerners, cowboy types, and so forth. And it really is, shows this idea of American masculinity on display in the Spanish-American War. Roosevelt is such a central figure in it that that critics at the time, book critics called it should be titled "Alone in Cuba," but it made the Rough Riders just very famous, and these became emblematic of the war. Now, so there's the charge of the Rough Riders, San Juan Hill, July 1st, 1898. They're rocking and so forth. But then what you have that's not as well known is the charge of the 10th Cavalry Colored at San Juan Hill. They also participated in the charge, and they played a role as great or greater than that of the Rough Riders. And it says here, heroic charge of the 10th Cavalry at San Juan, which suggests that this operation achieved a measure of fame, but it quickly went out of focus. And the Spanish-American War, like many American conflicts, foregrounded the contribution of white soldiers and pushed into the background the contribution of African-American soldiers, so that it's really a long time. It's really not until after World War II that African-American troops really come into their own as being considered to be first-line combat troops. There are two American infantry divisions composed of African-Americans during the Second World War, but these divisions were nowhere near as famous as some of the other American infantry divisions, like the Big Red One, the first division that landed at Omaha Beach, and so forth. So what I want to get at here is you're dealing at a time when the superiority of the white race is taken for granted, and there's such a heavy filter for this that it's very easy for the contribution of African Americans to drop out of sight or to be deliberately ignored, and this occurs even in the Spanish-American War. Here's the Battle of Santiago Bay, July 3rd, 1898, that I've already told you about. Okay, you can see some of the American vessels in the foreground. In the background, you can see the Spanish fleet, on fire, and so forth. And and then down at the bottom you have sort of like the well-known officers, all the captains of the various American battleships and heavy cruisers and so forth that participated in this decisive victory. Now, the war ends, and nominally, the United States has freed the Cuban people from the tyranny of the Spanish. By the end of by August, operations have ceased in Cuba. In early 1899, a final peace treaty is signed. But the fate of the Cubans after the war is not complete independence. Cubans are given the right to self-governance, but Cuba for a long time, and this goes into the latter part of the 1950s, is essentially an American protectorate. We talked about informal empire. The United States didn't have any colonies in the European sense, but what they did have, and Cuba is an example of this, was, the United States exerted a tremendous amount of influence over the Cuban economy. The Platt Amendment, this is a congressional amendment passed in the wake of the Spanish-American War, gave the United States the right to intervene in Cuba to make sure that the Cubans paid their debts, to regulate Cuban relationships with other foreign policies, and basically to say that Cuba could not have any independent foreign policy, that was the purview of the United States. And so the United States isn't directly administering Cuba, and isn't saying you're a colonial possession and so forth, but the American relationship with Cuba had a lot of the characteristics of a colonial relationship. And this was not lost on the Cuban people. When you have the Cuban Revolution finally in 1959, this is the point at which the Americans, are finally sort of, kicked out of their dominant position economically and in other kinds of terms in Cuba. Next, we have the audit of war. And what I mean by that is, in the wake of a war essentially tests, whether the armed forces, a given set of armed forces, are up to the task of fighting a war, and where their strengths are and where their weaknesses are. So as I give this presentation, it is April 2022. The Russians have invaded Ukraine. People thought that the Russian army surely was up to the task of defeating Ukraine in short order, but the audit of war, the actual invasion by the Russians of Ukraine, showed major deficiencies, in the ability of the Russian armed forces to actually execute this operation that many people thought was something that was well within the capabilities of the Russian army. That's what I mean by the audit of war. After the Spanish-American War, everybody thought like, okay, the U.S. Navy, they rocked in this war, but for the Army, there were so many screw-ups that it was a victory that felt like a defeat. I mean, if you were just kind of looking on, from a civilian standpoint, you heard about the San Juan Hill and all the glamour and so forth like that. But if you were involved in the war itself, you saw basic issues with transportation, with supply, with just all sorts of things, mostly logistical things, that suggested that the United States Army had really lucked out in terms of defeating the Spanish. It was fortunate that the Spanish made their own share of major mistakes, and their heart wasn't really in the war, and that under other circumstances, the United States Army could have had real problems in this operation. Comparatively few American soldiers were killed in action during the Spanish-American War, but afterward, when American troops were sort of repatriated to the United States, who were not yet demobilized, tens of thousands of them awaited discharge at a place called Montauk Point in the state of New York. It's on Long Island, and they died of disease by hundreds, but by far the most deaths in the Spanish-American War occurred due to disease, poor sanitation, um, and things of that sort. So, just sort of avoidable disasters that occurred really because the United States Army was not up to the logistical challenge of conducting itself in a war. So there is afterward the creation of something called the Dodge Commission. You can read about it for the Common Defense. It's named for Grenville Dodge, who was a Civil War general who later became a major railroad figure, very no-nonsense guy, conducted a really good review of the strengths and weaknesses of the American military performance in the Spanish-American War, and a person who really came under a lot of fire as being responsible for sort of the various screw ups was the Secretary of War during the Spanish-American War, a guy named Russell Alger, and you see him on the left. Now, the Dodge Committee actually exonerated Alger and basically said there's a lot of screw ups, but Alger, just inherited a lot of problems that he wasn't able to overcome, and it was unreasonable to expect him to overcome. But President William McKinley fired Alger anyway, because you really could not overcome the political perception that Alger had, was responsible for much of the American screw up. And sort of emblematic of this logistical screw up is something called the embalmed beef scandal. American forces were given canned rations to eat, and if you open these cans, it was like, oh my God, what the hell is this? And it was really substandard beef that you were getting out of these cans. And the sense was a lot of American soldiers became sick because of this lousy beef. And so, and the idea of embalmed beef, you all know that embalming fluid and so forth, gives a very vivid picture of how people felt about these cans of beef. Well, actually, this embalmed beef thing was a subset of the fact that the American meatpacking industry was just horrible at the time. You would bring in cows to be slaughtered, and they'd have major boils and abscesses, on them, and these all got sort of, involved with, with the meatpacking stuff. And Theodore Roosevelt, as president, sort of read an account, what was kind of an investigative expose of what went on with the meatpacking industry in general. He's like breakfast, eating some bacon one morning. It's like he just throws up because what he's reading is so nauseating. This problem with the meatpacking industry leads to the creation in 1906 of the Food and Drug Administration. And I emphasize administration because here you have the progressive notion that society is now so complicated that it can't be a matter of let the buyer beware, or in the rural area who the local butcher is, you can trust him to provide good meat and so on. You need to have government oversight of the meatpacking industry, and this of course extends to other firms that manufacture or create the American diet, and then also the drugs that Americans take. And then in the years afterward, these administrative organizations proliferate. You get the rise of the administrative state. Well, the Spanish-American War has something to do with that. Now, moving on to the Philippine War. Here is where the rubber really meets the road in terms of the perception of Europeans at the time and of Americans that white people were superior to the non-white people, and if you read the poem "The White Man's Burden" by Rudyard Kipling, which you very definitely should, it is all about white men have the burden, have the responsibility, and it's a heavy responsibility, for taking the rest of the world, that is basically primitive and barbarous and backward and uneducated and so on, and bringing them up to speed. And there's a complete, obliviousness to the fact that European colonization itself contributed to the very problems that white people identified and said, and sort of blamed people of color for. And this cartoon comes out in 1898, and what you can see is an American soldier, looks very much like Theodore Roosevelt, bodily carrying a caricatured African or African American man uphill to a building labeled schoolhouse. So so this basically ignorant quasi-savage black person is going to be bodily taken by Americans or Europeans or whatever up to an area where he's going to be educated. Society's going to be educated. Okay? And you might say, well, this is really racist. Yeah, no kidding. But what I want you to understand is the way in which at the time Europeans and white Americans understood their place in the world and their responsibility, their moral mission. You see some of this going on in Cuba, but where this becomes particularly problematic is in the realm of the Philippines. Now, in terms of the background to the Philippine War, as in Cuba, there have been Filipinos for some time rebelling against Spanish authority there, and these were known as insurrectos, insurgents. And so, when the United States suddenly, defeated the Spanish in Manila, Manila Bay, and got a hold of Manila, all of a sudden they face the decision about, well, now that we got the Philippines, what are we going to do with it? And one thought was that, well, the only thing we really need in Manila or in the Philippines is the city of Manila itself. It's a major port city. It's a jumping off point for American merchant vessels and so on to refit and refuel before they make the run to the coast of China and get into the China market. And so we really need to get a hold of Manila. And then the next thought is, well, wait a second. The only way we can protect Manila is to control the island of Luzon, on which Manila resides. And then there's the idea that, well, maybe we don't need to get control of Manila or Luzon. This job's is getting a little bit big, for us. And do we really want to become an imperial power? Because it's impossible to think about annexing the Philippines without realizing, oh, this is going to involve, basically an imperial status for us. And do we really want this? And you have imperialists and anti-imperialists going at it in this annexation debate, and the imperialists prevail. And one of the reasons why they prevail is the sense that, hey, look, we really need to have Manila. In order to have Manila and defend it against European powers, because that's the other thing. If we don't take Manila, the Spanish are gone. Who's going to come in before us? Could be the Japanese, could be the Germans, could be people who are going to be adversarial and deny us the ability to use Manila. So we got to take Manila. Need to have Luzon to keep the Japanese or Germans or whoever from invading and the island and getting to the Manila. Well, as long as you got Luzon, don't you need to have the adjacent islands and so on? And before too long, the idea is, well, we need to control the entire Philippine archipelago. This consists of 7,000 islands. We were just looking at the major ones, and you can see, this is imposed on an American map, and you can see that you're talking about a vast area, essentially from New York City down to Birmingham, Alabama. If you want to know where Manila is, look at about the border between Ohio and Pennsylvania, approximately where Cleveland is, and you'll see this kind of big inlet, this kind of big indentation in that particular island. That's the location of Manila. So what goes on here is that you've got American forces in the Philippines, and they've defeated the Spanish, and then you've got the insurrectos, and they have also helped to defeat the Spanish. And either way, the Spanish are gone. And so the next thing is you have this kind of uneasy relationship between the American forces and the insurrectos. And the question is, there's this debate in the United States Senate over the treaty that's going to end the war formally with the Spanish, and one of the provisions of it is the annexation of the Philippines. So when it becomes clear that the Americans are going to annex the Philippines, the insurrectos, basically go to war with the United States. There's already been some minor fighting, because there's tension and suspicion and so forth. But this war begins and goes on, and it's in two phases. The first is a conventional war in 1899, when the insurrectos essentially create a regular army and try to defeat the Americans that way, and soon discover they can't do it. So between 1900 and 1902, they wage a classic guerrilla war. And this gets really messy, because with guerrillas, they sort of hide among the population. And so the American forces, can't be clear on, who the guerrillas are and who the civilians are, but there's a sense that, well, in this particular community, there's got to be guerrillas. And if there are not actual guerrillas in the town, the townspeople know who the guerrillas are and are therefore responsible for it and culpable for it. The insurrectos also, in areas that they controlled, even tenuously, forced Filipino civilians, rank and file, to pay taxes and to do other things to support their cause. And as time went on, the war between the United States and the insurrectos becomes increasingly savage. Now, just how savage is something that American military historians have disagreed about for a long time, because there were sort of stories of American atrocities that sort of have a limited documentary basis. And so it becomes a matter of, well, do you believe it happened, or do you not believe that it happened? And I've met military historians who take both sides, and the people who think that it didn't happen, and also think that there's no element of racism in the war at a time when racism is rampant in the United States. That's a dog that won't hunt, as far as I'm concerned, as far as any rational human being is concerned. But I'm telling you right now, there are military historians who think that, that the United States waged, a largely honorable war in the Philippines. Ultimately, and let me give you the last slide here, the next to last slide. This is really not a good illustration, but this is the best one available of an atrocity that is supposed to have occurred on the island of Samar. And the idea here is, well, these guerrillas in this area, they could be anybody. They could be any male. And so there's supposed to be the American commander in that area who simply orders the execution of everybody, every male 10 years old or older. Did it happen? Not really sure. Do people believe it happened? Yeah, this guy gets back to the States, and there's a whole big wrangle about it. Did he do it? Did he not do it? And so on. But there really is a sense on the part of some Americans that the U.S. conduct in the Philippine War was atrocious, and so it was a controversial war in that respect. And it's interesting that although most people have heard of the Spanish-American War, that's pretty common. A lot of Americans have never heard about the Philippine War, don't know that it lasted much longer, the Spanish-American War, don't know that casualties on both sides were much, much higher than the Spanish-American War. You can get the details in for the common defense. But it was a war really that people sort of pushed into the background. Now, how did the United States ultimately win the war? The fact of the matter is, a lot of Filipinos were just not that into the insurrectos. The insurrectos were heavy-handed with regard to the Filipino people. A lot of their attitude toward Filipino civilians bordered on extortion. And the leadership of the insurrectos was sort of highly centralized in the person of a guy named Emilio Aguinaldo. And in 1902, a comparatively small American force identified where Aguinaldo went to the location of his encampment, captured Aguinaldo. That decapitated the the leadership of the insurrectos, and the war sort of petered out, soon thereafter. To wrap things up, this is what the United States, looked like as of 1900. And here is a graphic representation of, this American informal empire. You can see that if we look over in the Caribbean, the United States, during the war, as a kind of a sideline, captured Puerto Rico from the Spanish. And that became the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. Probably would have become a state, except for the problem that the whole island, consisted of people who were non-English speakers and were not considered to be white, and so forth. This cropped up a number of times. It was after the Mexican War, there was talk of annexing all of Mexico, and then it's like, well, we really don't want to annex all these Spanish-speaking people who aren't white. Same thing happened in the Philippines. There were people who were, yes, insurrectos, who were opposed to the United States. But the United States also did, some real good in the Philippines. They did create schools to help educate Filipinos. They did create a better road system. They did create, modern sanitation systems. And some Filipinos were attracted to this. And the Americans, had a kind of a dual policy, what they called school books and Krags. The Krags meant the Krag Jorgensen rifle and school books. That's self-explanatory. So some Filipinos are like, this is cool. We kind of like the American occupation, and we kind of like to be part of the United States. And so there were some overtures of, hey, we'd like to become part of the United States. Can we become a state in the Union? And essentially they were told, no, because you're not white. And it was put just that starkly. So at the end of the Philippine War and the Spanish-American War, the United States, controlled Cuba, in the Caribbean, controlled Puerto Rico. It's not shown here, but the United States increasingly played a major economic role in Central America. There are territories that the United States had acquired. You've got Alaska way up there that we purchased in 1867. You see a succession of islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, what Alfred Thayer Mahan called stations along the way. And then over there, on the left-hand part of the map, you have the Philippine Islands, which became an American protectorate and did not finally achieve independence. The United States sort of had a policy of preparing the Filipinos for eventual independence, but this did not occur until after the Second World War in 1946. And the last thing I want to say is that actually the American relationship with the Philippines became a pretty good one over time, particularly when Filipinos and Americans fought together during the Second World War against the Japanese. But any way you slice it, at the turn of the 20th century, the United States had become an imperial power, no direct colonies, but an informal empire, and had also entered the realm of one of the world's acknowledged great powers. Okay, turn off the recording now.